Hi, I'm Augustus Reyes, and I'm a director of user experience at Google. I work in the search and experience organization where I lead an effort called Ecosystem UX.
This is August. The first time I met August was when he presented some of his thoughts on stage in front of 200 or so designers at a summit that I was attending. When he first came onto stage, he wore one of those iconic striped yellow, red, and blue hats with the propeller on top, you know, the one that everybody gets when they first join Google. This was August's second day on the job, and he was asked to address our entire design organization. Sitting there in the audience, listening to him talk with such passion and clarity about these complex and impactful topics, I just knew that I wanted him on the show, partly to share with our listeners the things that August has floating around in his mind, but also for myself, to get a chance to understand the world more like August sees it. August, can you help me understand kind of a few terms here that I've been looking at in regards to your work? Understand the difference between product and platform and ecosystems.
Okay, let me give you my snapshot of what I believe product, platforms, and ecosystems are. And I say snapshot because this is what I believe today, but it could be subject to change in the future.
I love how you say that. You said that the first time I heard you talk,
Yeah.
And I wrote that down. You said something like, I don't know anything, but this is a snapshot of what I believe right now. And I'm like, that's a great way to frame any statement.
It's important, particularly as designers, that we be fluid in our observations and interpretations of how things evolve. Because even like a couple decades ago, the idea of a product, particularly a software product, for example, was something that was in a box that you installed on a machine, and it had a beginning and an end. You start it up, you shut it down, the end. But today, a product experience could be something that is ongoing, whether it's like a video game or a service or some sort of social media where it is ongoing, whether you are participating in it or not, and that people jump in and out of that experience. So just in the span of a decade, you could see how even one's idea or definition of a product could evolve. So that's why I say snapshot, because my definition of a product 20 years ago would be very different from that of today.
I worked with a CEO for a while who would say things like, he's interested in strong convictions loosely held.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody else, I think it was at that conference, somebody said, or maybe it was you that said, we don't know if we're right, but we know what we think or something like that.
I do believe something along those lines,
Yeah.
Which is I find that it's important that teams have a lot of clarity. And so I think what I suggested was that we may be wrong, but we're not confused.
That's it. That's exactly it. Yeah. I interrupted you. Products, platforms, ecosystems.
Okay, so I think we kind of covered product. And I would say a platform, much like a physical platform, is a surface on which different products engage or interact or provide value to different users. So take the G Suite, for example. The sum of those applications or products comprises a platform for productivity. So one could say it is a productivity platform. And I'd say that a platform and an ecosystem are very similar, with one primary distinction, which is that an ecosystem can be comprised of a platform or platforms, but the difference is the emphasis or the shift from a first-party focus to a third-party focus. So platforms do invite participation from third parties or entities that lie outside of the creators of that platform, but an ecosystem embraces and probably focuses more on third-party involvement.
And as creators and as designers, does the work we do differ on when we approach each of these different areas?
Well, it should, because I think they delineate a different scope of work and a different level of complexity. And what's really exciting about ecosystems from a design point of view is with the focus on harmonizing the efforts of third parties, which could imply that they have intents or motives or incentives that are different from your own. Not only does that create a really complex problem to harmonize all of that, but I think it's also something very elegant. And the reason why I use the term elegant, just to be really precise, is I think elegance is complexity described in a simple way. So we often hear designers beat the drum about mastering simplicity. And I don't think simplicity is an end in itself. There could be things that are simple but not engaging or valuable. But on the flip side of that, there are things that are complex and could be off-putting or just too complex to be meaningful. And I think where design can add value is through elegance. In other words, taking complex systems or complex ideas and presenting them in a very simple way.
I heard you talk about design intent one time.
Mm-hmm.
And you said that the intent of design is to make you feel something. And I thought it was really, really interesting because we worked in a product world where we have metrics and we have numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Can you help me understand how you see I kind of want to say conflict, but it's this kind of friction between this design intent, which is to make somebody feel something, and this business intent, right, to move a number?
Oh, I see. I think when I mentioned that, I was talking about video games. Mm-hmm. I was asserting that the design intent of a video game is to make you feel something. And that's a little bit different from making a blanket statement about all design intent. But I think what you're tapping into is one of the ways that design adds value to a product development process. I often ask designers a question, what do you think the unique value that design adds to the product development process is? And I get responses like, oh, it's problem solving, or oh, it's creativity. But I don't think those are unique values. I would argue that every practice, whether it's engineering or product management, is problem solving or creativity. I think the design adds value in a couple of different ways. And one of them is what you talked about, which is it touches on the emotion, but really the way I would translate it is design adds cultural equity to a product. And that overlaps a lot with emotion. And just to give you a specific example, take a highly commoditized product, usually like a really major life purchase, like a car or a house. Okay, so if you look at the functional value of a car, they all basically get you from point A to point B. And then if you look at the economic value of a car, it's largely uniform. So what distinguishes one car from another? What helps drive the consumer? And I'm talking about consumer purchasing here. What helps drive a consumer towards one car rather than another? I'd argue that it's neither its functional or economic value that it generates, but rather kind of cultural value, the cultural equity that your decision has made. And what generates that cultural equity is design.
Can you define cultural equity?
Yeah, cultural equity are all the non-economic and non-functional benefits of a product.
Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of thinking about what motivates somebody to purchase one car or another, and crossing off those economic or what was the other one?
Functional.
Functional, right.
Yeah, we're talking about things like how does it look? How does it make you feel? What kind of status does it generate in your own mind?
Mm-hmm. Those are going to be like the questions that answer to cultural equity.
Yes.
Got it. I like that. Before hearing you verbalize it like that, I used to compare all of those types of decisions to like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Mm-hmm. Does this purchase help somebody actualize, or does it feed their family? Like where is it on that little pyramid? But this is an interesting construct to help you kind of understand what's going through somebody's mind when they're purchasing your product or using your design. You mentioned that the thing that I was keying into was when you were referencing video games, and you worked on Xbox for a while. And when you gave your presentation, you had this really great. I mean, the minute you pull up a Mario screenshot, everybody's going to be like, "Yes, I'm listening." So you put the classic NES controller right next to this Mario screenshot, and you told us about this framework called mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics.
Yes.
And this really lit me up, and this is like one of the reasons why I was like, okay, write this guy down. I want to talk to him after the conference. Can you walk me through mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics, and why it's so important for designers to understand?
Oh, yeah. So this framework, which is developed, and I'm going to mess up the citation, but I think by LeBlanc Lord and Robin Hunicke, and she lives here in the Bay Area, I think, is a model to think about how to really perfect the emotional outcome that the designer intends. And the way to bridge the emotional outcome to what we design is the system of mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. So the kind of shorthand for it is a mechanic in a system is a one-to-one relationship between, say, a user's input and the system's output. So going back to the slide you were referencing, if you push the button on the game controller and the avatar on the screen jumps, that's a mechanic. Or you push the directional controller in one way and the avatar on the screen runs in that direction, that's a mechanic. And then you get this kind of second order mechanic, the running jump. So if you push the directional controller and you hit the button, then you get a running jump. And you can see how the mechanics build off of each other to higher and higher levels of mechanics. Well, the thing is, even a single mechanic like jumping can be fine-tuned to give you a visceral response to what you're perceiving. And the mythology behind it is that Miyamoto, who designed pretty much every great franchise under Nintendo, had something called the Miyamoto box, where he would fine-tune every single mechanic so that when you press the button, the physics and the speed and the velocity of the jump was the most pleasing. And there are arguments about how to measure what is pleasing and displeasing to a player. It's that kind of care in thinking about every single mechanic of a software system that creates a much larger overall emotional response. Mm-hmm. An example in product design, since we were talking about cars earlier, like I don't know if you've noticed, but when you shut the door of, say, a really expensive car, it has a certain feel to it. It has a certain mechanic feel. It's very satisfying. And I'd argue that that is design. That's not an accident. The way the door feels when it's shut is absolutely explicit, and it's absolutely designed. And the outcome of it is a kind of reinforcement of the emotional outcome of, say, what a luxury car buyer might expect from this really complicated system that she or he has purchased. It's the same way with like slow closing kitchen drawers as well. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do,
like,
yeah.
They don't just slam shut. They kind of ease back in.
There's some Silicon Valley lore about the first iPod.
Yeah.
And how when Steve Jobs went to plug in a pair of headphones, it just kind of like went in and then it was just there. And he was like, where's the click?
Yeah.
Where's that snap that lets me know that like that it's held, you know? There's that mechanic that tells you, it reports back to you viscerally that something is achieved or something's going well, or something like that.
Yeah, and I think you're touching upon a larger issue, which is my hope for interaction design, which is, I think interaction design was born and populated by a lot of generalists, much like myself, you know. in thinking about what really creates very refined and elegant interaction design, my hope is that we can learn from people who already do that, which is the practice of game design, where the interaction of game design is so well crafted, down to painstaking detail at the mechanic level. It's my hope that we can bridge that kind of care and thoughtfulness into other kinds of software.
Yeah. And how do all these mechanics add up to dynamics?
Oh, the dynamics are, I guess, what you call the runtime behavior of a system. So let's say you have level 1 of Super Mario Brothers. You've already set up a whole system of mechanics. And now it's time to bring the player in. And each player brings in his or her own experience and bias and abilities. And so even though level 1 of Super Mario Brothers is pretty much identical at the mechanic level, when different players play through it, no two runtimes are exactly the same. It's the same way with chess, for example. Chess, I think, is comprised of 91 mechanics, and that's all the pieces, the board, the rules, everything that goes in the box. Yet, even though the mechanics of chess have remained the same for millennia, no two chess games are exactly alike. So that's the dynamic.
The runtime. And the aesthetic?
Oh, and the aesthetic is the emotional response. It's the outcome. How does the system make you feel when the user meets the mechanics? What is the impression? What is the aesthetic outcome or the emotional response that someone feels?
So when I was playing Mario Brothers with my kids 2 weeks ago, I introduced them for the first time. They're 7 and 5.
Yeah.
And they're exploring the mechanic, right? How do you make Mario jump? How do you make him hit the mushroom and grow? And then they're like, here, Dad, you finish the level for me. And I'm like, I have this map memorized from my childhood, and I run through it without breaking up speed. Just like a speed run through the level 1-1. Everybody's done that, right?
Yeah.
So the dynamic that I bring to that is like kind of a flawless execution of this episode, built on years of messing around in my bedroom as a kid. And the aesthetic that we all share at the moment is that I'm kind of like proud that I did it.
Yeah.
My kids are really impressed because they've played with the mechanics and they know that it's not exactly easy, at least on their level. So the aesthetic is different for everybody in that same experience. And what's interesting to me is that Miyamoto, the creator of the system, the thing that he has control of, and we as creators of our own systems have control of, is just that one piece early on, the mechanic.
Yes, that's the only thing that can be designed. The mechanics are literally the only thing that designers can affect. But the way it makes you feel is you have to measure and observe. You have to connect with the user to understand the kind of aesthetic outcome that a set of mechanics generates.
You mentioned that outcome can be described as a state of being.
Something like that, but not quite like that.
Can you correct me on that?
It's not really so much correction. It's if we think about zooming in and out of how we perceive a system, from a designer's point of view, we focus mostly on the mechanic level. I mean, that's the thing that we design. And then zooming out a bit, then there's the dynamic level. And zooming out even further, there's the aesthetic level. And the question that I posed is, well, what happens if you zoom out further than that? Well, I would call it a state of being. In other words, what is the sum total of all your aesthetic responses at any given moment in time? And well, that's really your state of being at that moment. So that's what I meant by state of being. So if I was to extend the mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics, or MDA model, it would be mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics, state of being. I think that would be the next logical step.
And so that state of being is a result of repeat aesthetic experiences, and then the summation equals up to the state of being.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, it could either be at a given moment in time or over a period of time.
Can you give me an example in your career when the thing that you've been laboring over. You're adjusting the mechanics, and then you see how it works up into somebody's state of being.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true. Like with any product, there's some products that are successful, and people talk about how it helps them in their day-to-day lives, that they find value in it, they find a bit of pride or a sense of accomplishment. And whether that happens through playing a video game where the kind of end result lives and dies within the system, the emotions that someone feels when they play with a game are very real. It doesn't discount the feelings of frustration or victory or triumph or anxiety or defeat. Those are all authentic emotions. But extending that into more practical outcomes from, say, I don't know, like a productivity app or an operating system, the emotional outcomes that those products produce are also real, but they also have implications about values that are generated outside of the system itself.
Is this idea of traversing this MDA model, zooming in and zooming out, like you said earlier, is this leading up to what you said about the resolution of the solution should match the resolution of the problem space?
Yeah. When we look at those different levels of designing a system, one could say that they're different resolutions of the same phenomenon. And this was totally inspired by Charles and Ray Eames' film Powers of Ten, where if you haven't seen it, you should take a look. But it looks at the same phenomenon from different points of resolution, different powers of 10, from the microscopic to the galactic.
Yeah. Why is it helpful to see the same phenomenon in all those different zoom levels?
Oh, because it helps capture the context of the thing that you're designing. And I think we often limit ourselves to one level of context. There's a book by Christopher Alexander, architecture professor at Berkeley, called Notes on the Synthesis of Form. And what he asserts, or what I believe he asserts, is that the form of an artifact is defined by the synthesis of the forces that surround that form. So when we create an artifact, like say a tea kettle or a chair or a piece of software, there are many forces that are influencing the form of that artifact, whether they're economic, social, utilitarian, cultural. And the context of those forces happen at many, many different levels, not just the local one. And so when I say something like the resolution of the solution should match the resolution of the problem space, it's important to understand the context in which a solution lies by understanding the resolution of the problem that you're trying to solve. So if you're trying to solve a feature level design problem, then it's important to understand the forces that influence the formation of that feature. Typically, it's like, okay, what is the software stack that it's being built on? What are the business goals? What are the user metrics? But then when you go up to a higher power of 10, where you think about it on a product level, then it's the sum of the features, but you also have to take into account those same forces or that same context at a product level. And then you go up to the platform level. Well, then you're starting to deal with, say, you could introduce something like governmental forces, like are there legal policies that affect this platform? And then if you go even further to an ecosystemic level, then the context helps define or inform the product design process at that level. So that's what I mean by the resolution of the solution should match the resolution of the problem space.
I find that really helpful. And I'm so grateful that you kind of defined it this way in this conversation too, because I had that in my notes from your conference talk, and I was like, I don't quite get it. Because I actually, on a personal note, find zooming in and out sometimes to be problematic for me. If I zoom out far enough, I lose my empathy. Everything doesn't matter. We're all going to die in a heat death. Oh wait, zoom back in. Get back into that human element. And then maybe zooming in too far, like this is too important. This is too beautiful. This is my most precious thing, and put too much of myself in it. And when I say too much of myself, I also mean that I require too much of myself to create it. And that becomes a problem when the thing doesn't work, or another person has another point of view on it, or whatever. It could be a lot of problems, right? To try to find balance in that. But this idea of traversing these zoom levels and finding the appropriate zoom level for the problem space is really helpful advice. So thanks for enumerating that for me. So now we're at this table, we're both designers. What kind of advice would you give to me? Like, how can I leverage this information of mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics? What can I do with this information?
Well, I would say the first thing is realize that you can only design at the mechanic level, but that doesn't mean that you design in isolation. Of course, there are usually business or economic intents, business goals. There are also utilitarian goals like time to task completion or hitting a particular metric. But the goal that we as a design practice should own is what is the cultural or emotional outcome. And it's important to set those goals and also to measure and block out a path from the specific mechanic, whether it's a feature or a control you're designing explicitly, directly, and mark out a path between that and how a person feels using the system or the set of mechanics that you've created. And the way to do that is, if I was to answer at a functional level, is maybe user research. But really at a broader level, it's understanding the user. And there are kind of three layers of abstraction about understanding how a mechanic system affects a user at the aesthetic or emotional level. And the first is just by being informed. If a user research team runs a study, it's important to include in the research question or the set of research questions how a feature or product makes the user feel. So that's kind of the first level of abstraction. But to remove that, the second level would be to observe directly. Like, you could sit in on a user research study and observe all the nuances, the body language, the facial expressions directly by observing. And at a kind of third level is directly engaging with the user themselves. And then we get into the territory of co-creation or co-design, where you and the user can design together. And that steps into the area of inclusive design as well. So there's an entire spectrum of ways of understanding or drawing a path between what you do day to day and how it affects both the aesthetic or emotional outcome of the user, but also her or his state of being, if you want to go to a higher resolution than that.
I love it. This has been really great. Thank you so much for stopping by, having this conversation with me. I've taken a lot out of it. Is there anything else you want to go in this conversation before we close?
Oh, no.
Okay.
This was a real pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Great, man. All right. As always, you can find more information about the things that we've talked about in the show notes at design.google/podcasts. This episode was recorded and edited by Brian Gordon and produced by Barbara Eldridge. The artwork you see for this episode and, all of the episodes is created by Skip Hirsch. Subscribe to the show on Google Play, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Brian told me the other day that it's on Spotify now too. And if you like this episode, please leave a review because it helps new listeners to find the show. All right, that is it from all of us at the Google Method. Thanks for listening.